Looking back at the origins of family drug support, it really started in June 1996 when I arrived back from a holiday to confront my son sitting waiting for me, who told me he'd been using heroin for 18 months. The feelings of shock, fear, guilt and grief that I encountered that day were immense, and it was at that point, starting to try and reach out, that I felt very alone and realized that for family members there wasn't very much support. Obviously I didn't do anything about that at the time. It really made it very, very difficult for me to deal with what we were then to deal with over the next 12 to 18 months. Damien tried very hard to stop using heroin, and I was very much trying to enforce that. He switched drugs to alcohol, and in fact dealing with alcohol was worse than heroin. Heroin was relatively easy for me as a family member to deal with it because I didn't know about a lot of it. It was quite secretive and quite hidden. Alcohol was very in my face, so coping with those 12 months was very, very difficult. And then, of course, he died. He died from an overdose. It was unexpected. I didn't realize for 3 days that he was dead. I got a phone call from a police person in Chatswood who asked me to go and identify his body. That was a very, very traumatic and difficult time, and yeah, I guess it's a shock that nobody should have to face. I did get an enormous amount of support, and I should really at this point say that my wife Sandra has been an incredible support for me, both in the early days when we were dealing with Damien's drug use, and then after his death and the start of FDS. So he died. I obviously then went into grief. The grief is hard to talk about. It's hard to tell anybody who's never experienced it, especially the grief of the loss of a child. But it's so incredibly painful. And I guess there are the stages that are well known about grief. And I was in the anger stage, and I wanted to get the dealers. That was my first motivation: stop this happening, get the dealers, get rid of them all. And I realized, through talking to police people actually, that that was a fruitless exercise. I was finding out about heroin and heroin deaths, and came to realize that the deaths were preventable. So I guess listening to some politicians who'd canned the possibility of a heroin prescription trial and put aside the idea of consumption rooms, I got quite angry, and I wrote a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald. That letter was published. I got quite a flurry of media after that. I took part in a program that looked at heroin and the problems associated with it. I told Damien's story, and then I started to get letters from all over Australia from family members. And so I realized that it wasn't just me and my family dealing with this, it was hundreds of people, and basically saying they had the same story and what could be done. So we held a public meeting. A lot of people came to that meeting, 300 or 400 in a very small church. And the family's needs and the energy was so great that at the end of the meeting, I realized we couldn't just leave it and walk away. I asked for people who might be interested in being involved in something to give me their details, and we started to talk about doing something. I had no idea what I was going to do. I certainly never realized that we were going to be embarking on what we did, and that it was going to take me to where it's taken me, or that I'd still be doing it all these years later. But that was the start of it. Some great people put their hands up, and we started talking, and just very gradually started to run support groups for families, and then it kind of took off from there. One of the people who contacted me from the media that I'd done was the then Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr. He rang me and said he'd like to talk to me. I went into his office. I think I had a 2-hour meeting with him. And he told me that after that meeting, he changed his mind. He'd had some personal experience with drugs in his family and had been quite angry about drug use and drug users. But he started to see another side when he listened to what I was telling him about what I was experiencing and what these other family members were telling me. So he offered me a small amount of money to start our service. We started our telephone line back in 1998. At that time, heroin was the main drug that was affecting Australia. It was in the media the whole time. And we took about 5,000 calls in that first year. We started running support groups. I think we were running 9 different groups around Sydney. And people started to come to me saying, how can I help? And I guess one of the fantastic things about family drug support is that we've always had great people involved, great volunteers. Now we've got fantastic staff members, and that's enabled me to be able to do what we do and to expand to where we are. It's been an interesting journey. We've had a lot of adventures along the way. We were involved in the act of civil disobedience at the Wayside Chapel, where we actually opened up an injecting facility. It stayed open for a couple of weeks, and that directly, I think, led to consumption rooms being on the agenda of the 1999 Drug Summit and the opening of the injecting facility in King's Cross. That was an interesting event, and quite honestly, we thought that that would be the start of major change. Very disappointingly, it hasn't been. There's been very slow progress in terms of change to policy and bringing in new ideas since then, but at least we got that one. There's now another one in Victoria, and we are still pushing to change things.